Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us at the Creating Inclusive Economies, Building Bridges Between the Private, Public, and Civil Society Sectors Conference. My name is Kyle Rich. I'm an assistant professor at Brock University and a board member at the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. And I'm going to be your MC for the next 2 days. So I'm going to walk you through different ways that you'll be able to interact with people, the speakers, and the panelists at the conference over the next few days. And I really encourage you to take the time to engage in as many ways as you can. To start, you can check out the Smart Matching function. There's a green button for this at the top of your screen. This will allow you to connect with and find people who have similar interests to you in both professional and maybe whimsical or fun different ways. You'll also be able to set up meetings with these folks or to chat with them throughout the conference as you'd like. We also invite you to engage in the discussion as part of the conference, so using the chat function on the side of your screen, and to take the discussions beyond the conference. So by engaging us on social media or however you're joining with us today. So in particular, you can join us on Twitter by using the Inclusive Economies 2021 hashtag or Économie Inclusive 2021. And we encourage you to do this throughout the weekend or throughout the next 2 days. If you do have any trouble at any point, you can always click the question mark in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and this will bring you immediate assistance should you need it at any point. So please don't hesitate to use that tool if you need it and get everything sorted out. It's now my extreme pleasure to welcome our co-chairs and our conference hosts today. First, we have John Buck, who's the president and CEO of SEDEC. And we also have Kathleen Kevany, who is the president of SURF. So to open the conference, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen. Kathleen, are you ready to kick this thing off?
I am ready and eager. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Kyle. Today's diverse sessions are going to be educational and delightful. And tomorrow's program will focus on community economic development, trade impact, and inclusion, and will be ably led by my co-host, John Buck. So good day, John.
Good morning, Kathleen, and good morning to everyone. Welcome to the conference. Kathleen, let me express to you what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here co-hosting with you. It's a real privilege for SEDEC to be part of this with the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. And we're really excited about the roster that we have lined up for today and for tomorrow. And speaking about tomorrow, something that I'll be playing a more of a direct role in leading us through the day. It will really be focusing on economic development, collaborative economic development, and really opportunities for economic growth. We know, and I think all of us have experienced this in very personal ways. We've been living through some pretty extraordinary times, and certainly things like automation, inequality, migration patterns, digital economy, green economy have created a great amount of disruption and presented us with some opportunity. And you combine that with a pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and there's a lot to talk about. So very excited that tomorrow we've lined up some of the leading minds in collaboration in economic development and growth, and looking forward to hearing from some practitioners and learning from them. So I can't wait for tomorrow, Kathleen, and looking forward to participating throughout today.
That's great, John. What a great kind of segue getting us going, and your enthusiasm is contagious. Yeah, there is tremendous amount of work that takes place at the community level. And this is where the practical insights are developed and rooted to really foster greater creativity and prosperity in rural economies. So on this account, I must give a big shout out and a thank you to TELUS for joining us on this important topic as our presenting sponsor. And I also extend to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada our thanks for ongoing funding and support to make this conference possible. So to start us off properly, I would like to acknowledge First Peoples and Traditional Territory and the lands that we are meeting on. So although we are all joining from different places, where I am currently located is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I also acknowledge that this is area covered by the treaties of peace and friendship which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people signed with the British Crown in 1725. And our hosting partner, SEDEC, are located in the traditional territories of the Abenaki, the Algonquin, the Cree, Huron-Wendat, and the Maliseet. Treaties really are constitutionally recognized agreements and represent respectful partnerships between Indigenous people and the Crown. And these treaties have often been betrayed due to our colonial practices. Discrediting the rights of Indigenous peoples and continuing to harm them and exploit the lands and resources are unconscionable. As a group invested in issues pertaining to rural Canada, we acknowledge the past and current injustices that colonialism has had on lands and its original peoples. And in this last year alone, we all have been a witness to the uncovering of thousands of unmarked graves of children neglected and buried without acknowledgement. We know that Boyle advisories continue to be forms of injustice, along with many other issues that need attention. So as a privileged white settler, I take my responsibility to educate myself and others and to walk in collaboration with partners from Indigenous communities. And it's necessary also that we acknowledge and celebrate the many past and current contributions that Indigenous peoples make to our communities. The leadership of the Waterkeepers in Nova Scotia is but one example where the grandmothers are standing with their communities and allies to protect the precious resources from contamination and misuse, and we stand with them. And as the Surf Board, we are engaged in discussions of how our organization can ensure our principles and practices are committed to truth, reconciliation, and genuine inclusion. And we are all joining together today from different territories. And I encourage everyone to acknowledge the land they are on by going to nativeland.ca. So now it is my great pleasure to help set the context nationally. We are really privileged to have with us today Ashley and Jennifer. So Ashley Whedon and Jennifer Christie will be giving us their perspective on where to from here, resetting the rural agenda in the 44th Parliament. Ashley Whedon is an award-winning rural futurist, feminist, and researcher, and her work focuses on the way people, place, and power dynamics are reflected in and affected by policymaking, and particularly in rural contexts. And Ashley holds a Master's of Public Administration. She's recognized as a thought leader on rural revitalization and a contributor to a growing body of research and advocacy on the right to be rural. Ashley works to advance evidence-based policy and public sector leadership across a wide variety of critical portfolios, including infrastructure, inclusive community economic development, innovation, and how to GSD, that is get stuff done, where Ash is a master. Jennifer is an influential marketing professional, community builder, restaurateur, and feminist. After starting her career in corporate marketing at John Deere Canada, Jen founded the Ag Women's Network to connect and empower women in the agricultural sector. While working in Ottawa for a national nonprofit, Jen met her partner, Chris, and soon after they moved back to Bruce County to start their entrepreneurial journey. Jen is the president of the local Chamber of Commerce, a member of 100 Women Who Care, Bray Bruce, and a vocal proponent for gender equality and agricultural leadership. Jen has a Bachelor of Commerce in Agricultural Business from Guelph and an Executive MBA from Ivey Business School. We are so thrilled to have you two wise women take the podium. Happy to pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Good morning. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And hi, Jen.
Hi, Ashley.
Well, we know that we have a short window to talk about an enormous agenda and something that Jen and I talk about just for fun most of the time and because we care about this. So we're delighted that SURF has offered us the opportunity to share that with a broader audience. And thank you, Kathleen and Kyle, John, Isabel, the team at SEDEC and at SURF for putting on this great show, as it were. This feels like a very high-end production, so I'm delighted to be here. When Jen and I were sort of talking about what we wanted to talk about this morning, we figured out that we could probably do this all day. We could probably take up your entire conference with what it means to reshape the rural agenda. But we did come up with kind of this notion of three kind of issues that are coming up for us that we want to focus on over the next sort of 25 to 30 minutes. And they include sort of a three aspect way of looking at this rural agenda. And for those of you that have worked with me before, you know that I'm a big fan of working in threes. I like alliteration. I like those things. They feel like good numbers, but they're also there's a lot of great science behind that in terms of these are the things where we can devote our attention to and our energy to. And so we're better off to focus on these key priorities than to spread ourselves too thin. So the issues that we were really looking at, and they could make up their own conferences in their own, were polarization and partisanship, priority setting, and how do we reshape those priorities around actual rural realities as they are today and the future we want to build tomorrow. And then how do we put care and courage at the center of the work ahead of us? So we're acknowledging that we've seen an increasing amount of distance between sides rather than recognizing ourselves as all part of a complex solution. We've seen an increase in dangerous rhetoric, and the terms of engagement seem to have shifted to become so increasingly uncertain and dangerous, and how these have been stratified, and often rural areas have been weaponized as places that this rhetoric has been escalated around. We've also noticed that a sense of geographic narcissism, as you might call it, has been really driving a lot of our policy conversations in such a way that rural places do feel left out, despite being at the forefront and maybe at the precipice of a critical nexus of environmental change, of social justice, of how we're going to navigate what the future looks like. And third, we're all exhausted. This has been an incredibly hard stretch. Most of us, our tanks were empty in March 2020, and I've had great conversations with many, but this was recalling a conversation in particular with Ryan Gibson, who won't be a stranger to any of you, that the tanks were empty then, and we've been running on fumes through a time of great upheaval and crisis ever since. And so how are we going to take care of each other so that the people who are joining us today are able to continue that work now and into the future? So that gives you a sense of the kind of conversation that we wanted to share with you this morning. And for those of you who were at the 2019 conference in St. John's, you'll remember a conversation I had with Bianca Wiley. This will take a very similar tone in terms of just sort of a great fireside chat style, although it's more of a laptop side chat style conversation these days in order to keep us all safe in what is an ongoing crisis, because I would like to remind everyone that it's not over, right? We're deep in this work as we continue. So the questions that I had written down are really around this idea of how do we emphasize interdependencies with each other? You know, what does it mean to live and work communally, particularly when we start talking about rural versus urban, Jen? You know, like when we start looking at this idea around the rural-urban divide, that language no longer really feels helpful. In fact, it feels at risk of driving us further apart. And as we've seen in this last election, that rhetoric has become even more fraught and volatile. And so from your perspective, Jen, you know, like what does it mean to address that polarization? What are you seeing in your experience in terms of the work that you're doing in communities, and how do we overcome that?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I think what we saw in this last election was actually not a lot of change, right? And but we definitely saw a more negative campaign, or more negative from the public standpoint, I think, and in some ways, I think what we've seen in the last two federal elections is very much parallel to what we've been seeing in Ontario for, the last 15 years that I have started to pay more attention and be more politically engaged, I think. So how do we change it? I mean, on a big scale, unfortunately, this type of work environment over the last 18 months hasn't helped anything. And certainly social media, we know, is not helping things. But I think on a very local level and a smaller scale, at least, because obviously all politics is local, and I think if we try to focus too big, it can be very easy to get very feel overwhelmed with it. So I think if you bring it back to a local context, knowing that this pandemic is not over, but it's so important that we can get people back together. The decisions that we are having to make, and from a government level, and in our communities, oftentimes are decisions that one presentation in a meeting can't convey all the information we need. We need people to be able to be face to face, to be able to have lots of conversations, and to be able to delve into a lot of these really important topics, because there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of things. And I saw, I think I saw it on social media somewhere in the last couple of weeks. It's really hard to hate people up close, and so I think as much as we can, keeping people safe, but bringing people back together into spaces. And that's something rural communities, I think, those community events, right? The fall fair dinners, the Legion dinner, the Legion suppers, like these are more than just community dinners, right? Those are the places where people in communities are gathering. And so to bring it back to, the question in the rural and the urban piece, we've seen a lot of migration of people from urban communities to rural communities during the pandemic. And we've not had these mechanisms that traditionally have been the ways that people have been able to integrate within their communities and get to know one another, and build some of those bridges and understanding between people, and understanding their differences and where they come from. We in a lot of rural communities, those types of things just they haven't been recreated online, or they can't be recreated in the same fashion, right? And so not knowing how we solve it on a big scale, I just think locally being able to have people back together in spaces. And so I guess from a policy standpoint, that means doing the things that we have to do as leaders, as community leaders, or as elected officials, to make sure that people can be back together. Humans are social beings, and that means being in the spaces with other people, versus just these types of events, which are great, but you just can't get all of that back to back, and the side conversations that are really important for getting to know one another.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I read this great comment from Heidi Moore on Twitter, and it was, part of what we're being pushed to do right now is thinking communally. And in fact, what we've seen over the last couple years, and certainly maybe even longer than that, over the arc of increasing kind of what Andre Rodriguez-Posay called the revenge of places that don't matter, what we've seen over this kind of increasing feeling of almost everybody feels left out, and so then who's left in, right? Like, who's still left in if everyone feels like an outsider? And then how do you confront this idea of people that maybe are on the inside but have been made to feel like they're on the outside? So how do we push against that? And Heidi Moore was saying, we're being pushed to think communally, so we're going to be exposed to more and more challenging, she said revolting, examples of individualism until we get it, right? Healing is what you're talking about, Jen, strikes me as exactly what others have said, is that healing occurs communally, and we're cut off from each other right now. And part of the challenge we have right now is we're pushing a lot of these conversations to the individual rather than at the policy and structural level, where those decisions can set up that better communal living. So when we start talking about things like this election felt like a very personal, individualized election, and the pandemic, we're even using language, it's the pandemic of the unvaccinated now. These priorities that we're moving forward, emphasis on climate change, don't use straws, regardless of the fact that there's only a handful of companies that contribute more than 70% of the climate damage occurring right now. This force between, this relationship between the individual and society becomes so much more important. And I think is really at the crux of what we're being challenged to do after an age where we maybe didn't have to do that as much. And so when we start looking at that, combating this individualism through this notion of rural communities and versus urban communities, which I hate that framing, we're all in this together rather than us against each other, and even rural against rural, right? We've set up all of our funding to be competitive around, I've got to compete against my neighbors rather than figure out how to work that way. So, what are those access points for the policy change and investment to stop thinking about it at that individual level and really start pushing as we head into this next parliament? our decision makers to think about this in an important way? What is that? I know you're in this on a variety of things. You're really engaged with your local council. You're really engaged in federal and provincial politics. You're kind of at all spectrums of this, the private sector, public sector, all the way across. What are those entry points, do you think?
Well, I think so. During the pandemic, at the start at least, we saw all parties work together, right, for the benefit of Canadians. And I've become a really big fan of these cross-party committees that particularly look at specific areas or issues. I know there's an agriculture committee as an example, and historically, those committees have been whether they meet. I know there's formal committees, but then there's I think that forum has worked well with our elected officials coming together kind of outside of the political spectrum to really focus on specific areas or communities or issues or what have you. Couple weeks or a month or so ago, with Catapult Grey Bruce and the Startup Canada community, we had the opportunity to meet with that committee that looks at specifically the cross-party committee that's looking at startups and entrepreneurship support in Canada, and that was really great because we had folks in the room from all parties that were saying the same things, and I think for a lot of us that's really especially in such a time of uncertainty, like we want to be able to hear some sort of level, some sort of alignment on things, and acknowledging that things, when things aren't great, and being willing to address those issues. And so I think for me that's an opportunity, particularly as advocates for rural communities and policy inclusion for rural. I think that's one way I think we could get our voice heard maybe, and get a little bit get more into some of those conversations, because you're right, this talk of the divide, right, like we are as guilty of using that language as anyone, and feeling like we're left out of it. But we're also, from my experience, I feel like rural communities are also very used to having to work for the community, because there's a lot of things that if people don't step up in either their volunteer capacities or with their with their business hats on, some things don't happen. So I think it's a mindset that isn't foreign to rural communities, but certainly as our communities are changing and evolving through this time, we're having to relearn some of these things, and as you said, some of those people have been doing those things for a long time and are getting to that point where I think they're feeling burnt out. And as you said, they were burnt out before the pandemic, and so they're seeing this as an opportunity to kind of step back when we need these things even more now.
Yeah, and I know you and I have been talking about this in a totally different avenue. The things like the farm wife discussion keep raising their head in rural communities, and I couldn't help but think of our amazing Fran Shaver, who we inducted as a lifetime member here, and her important work on that we hope decades ago would have maybe turned the corner on settling some of this nonsense. But when we look at internal to a lot of the things that happen in and around rural communities, sometimes I feel it's a bit disingenuous that we go to sort of urban leaders and say, look, you've got to do things the way we say, because we're not figuring our own stuff out in a lot of ways. And, this kind of craziness around what does an inclusive rural place look like? How do we address those things? And if we haven't settled this notion without resorting to vitriol, the comments on this is a tweet raised by a very prominent rural advocate, Megs Reynolds, talking about, how demeaning it feels to be referred to as a farm wife rather than a farmer or an agricultural operator or an equal partner in the business. And looking from the outside, I have kind of some self-consciousness about that and being like, oh my God, can we just not do this because it makes us look ridiculous. And it also is so frustrating and disheartening because it's still happening. It's still these conversations we're looking at. And I think whether we're looking at gender, whether we're thinking about, respectful nation to nation relations and what that means, particularly in the context of this week and this coming Thursday, all of this feels a little bit like, okay, like this is the minimum. So what does it look like to go beyond the minimum in terms of pushing that forward? And how do we set that, as you said, working locally so that works upward into our provincial and national agendas? In your experience, are there examples that you're seeing of people pushing that forward that's maybe a bit more hopeful than seeing some of that narrative surface lately?
Yeah, I mean that narrative was it took a few days for me to wade back into that because it takes a lot of energy but it's certainly absolutely not a new narrative. Interestingly enough, last night somebody liked a tweet from a 2017 thread that I was part of that was essentially the same conversation with some of the same people. And I think, like I had mentioned, we delved into this with the Ag Women's Network a few years ago too, exploring these titles, right, of farmer, farm her, farm wife, and not shockingly, what we discovered was everybody identifies individually, and depending on what their role is and what they're doing and how they their preference. Which this is not surprising. This is human nature, and it still makes me think how, in these communities where women have been playing these roles for hundreds of years, and how are we? This was the same conversation when the Saskatchewan cattle men decided not to table a resolution to change their name. When across the country we have examples of beef farmers of Ontario have changed their name like 12 years ago. So it's frustrating, but I think also really important that we continue to keep pushing these conversations, because it will lead to dinner table conversations where understanding and people will learn, and that's where we'll grow. In terms of a really great example, I think Beef Farmers of Ontario is one of those great examples, because over a year ago, following the murder of George Floyd, they sat back and said, we can't be quiet on this. We recognize that there's a lot of people who work within our supply chain and our customers, that this affects them, and that we do have racial injustice in Canada as well, and we are as much part of that conversation as farmers that are producing food for the tables of Canadians as anyone else is. And so they stepped forward, and they were the only agriculture organization that came out and made a statement, and it wasn't a statement that was full of platitudes. It was essentially like, we have not done any work in this space, but recognize how important this is, and we are going to do something. And they've been working on this they've been working on it since, because we don't just you don't just do a few things and this is done, right? So that was a really big deal, and I think when we talk about how do we as rural communities need to lead going forward, we need to be able to we need people and organizations to lead with this type of courage, because I know of other organizations who just to even I know of other organizations who could not make those bold statements and put themselves out there and just kind of said, this is the right thing to do and it's what we're going to do. And as a result, it's led to a lot of learning, and I think has done a lot of good for the industry to see an organization do that, because that's the other thing they did, was when they started to do some of the training and work with an outside third party, they also invited other commodity groups to be part of those conversations. So again, it wasn't just, it wasn't about them. It was about the industry, and I think that's a really great example that we can all look to and follow, and in a lot of these conversations, because we definitely have lots of work to do, right? And it's really, really important work.
Yeah, and I'm struck by, these twin thoughts of, right, it's both, we have to both kind of celebrate.
Il faut célébrer le courage et en même temps se demander pourquoi il est si incroyable que d'être une personne décente. On est dans les dernières minutes de notre conversation et quand je pense à ce que j'entrevois, ce que sont mes attentes du prochain cabinet, du prochain Parlement, c'est de mettre le courage et le souci au cœur de nos préoccupations. Moi, je suis un peu lasse, vous savez, de l'idée de l'équité des genres. Est-ce qu'il faut encore le faire? Et la conversation est apparue selon laquelle s'il y a une égalité des sexes, il n'y aura pas assez de place pour les hommes. C'était aux nouvelles. Au Global, ça fait partie de notre couverture parlementaire et moi, j'ai dû fermer la télé et me détourner. C'était trop pour moi. Et on voit de plus en plus de cela, savez-vous? Est-ce que il est question du courage et vous et moi, vous partagez la conversation. Si on va aller de l'avant, cette poussée des jeunes, par exemple, moi, je suis le pont, mais je suis vers la fin de cette cohorte. Mais
certainly being pushed by the people coming up next to and with us to think deeper and broader and bigger and better about what that looks like. And so if we're asking our elected officials to take these conversations, to listen to local examples, right? We bring back rural extension, bring back actual connectedness to communities, actually put these mechanisms of working together at the heart of how we form policy. That's maybe the only bit of nostalgia I have time for, is kind of like, let's look at the things that did work and continue to do them. But what does that look like, in that relationship with our elected representatives, to say, look, we need to take care of each other. We need to recognize courage, but also push for more than just courage in words, but courage in deed. What are you hoping out of your own, whoever's representing you, or what you're hoping to see out of the next cabinet as it forms the next parliament? How do we kind of keep people's feet to the fire about that without burning ourselves out in the process? How are you taking care of yourself and your own advocacy as well?
Well, and I guess one thing I want to say, just going back, like, I think one thing that I find so challenging working with any government is, the timeframes that they're working with are never long enough to actually enact the change that we truly want to work on. And so I don't know how we change that, but, I was reminded again just last week when I was meeting with the Nuclear Innovation Institute, right? They're looking at horizons that are 30 years down the road. Like, that in itself was just a major source of energy and renewal and optimism for me, because I think we've gotten ourselves into the 24-hour news cycle and the election cycle and the government cycle of we only get really about 2 years out of a full government before they're back in the election cycle. And so, and I mean, any way we can encourage these longer term horizons, because the issues that we're looking at that are, I think are critical, and I know you think are critical, Ashley, right? Like, climate change is not going to be solved in a 4-year election window, and neither is, reconciliation. We have hundreds of years of injustice injustices to address and relearn our, what, and reform those relationships properly, that's not going to be fixed in an election cycle. So I think any way we can push for, longer horizons on policy and programs, I think is really important. The other thing I feel like we have this here locally, even though our elected representative in Ottawa is not sitting in the government, he's very open to meeting with anyone in the community. And I think as things have become polarized, I think it's very easy to assume that, even if your MP, maybe if you don't share the same political stripes as them, or they're not sitting in the government, it's very easy to assume that they don't, they're not interested in what you have to say. And I think we have to also be courageous and reach out to them on the regular basis and inform them. And I'm sure there's lots of people in this audience that do that, but I think sometimes I think in the polarization we've maybe lost a little bit of that local touch, and related to that, I really think it's important that the sitting government also engage those local constituents, particularly when they're, we see this when they make announcements in a community. Are they inviting the local elected representative to be part of that, and are they even engaging them in the conversation when they're looking at things for those communities, because chances are most of these ministers are not going to have rural backgrounds, right? There's just not a lot of liberal rural MPs so that were elected, so it's going to be really important again for those cross-party conversations are going to be really, really important to make sure that that the rural context is considered, and as investments are being made in rural communities, that there really is truly an understanding of what that impact is going to be in those communities, and what the needs actually are of those people, because I think that goes a long way then to making sure that the people that are doing that work, that you all, that are tired, as tired as I am probably, that you know then that you have been heard, and that your concerns are acknowledged, which I think at the end of the day is one of the most important pieces in this kind of work, right? Is at least if you've heard me, and I know you've heard me, then I've done all I can do. So those are some of my thoughts.
I love it, and I'm just knowing the time and that we're going to transition to our next session, but Jen and I could easily, like I said at the top, we could have this conversation all day, every day. In fact, we often do. And so if you're looking to find us, I know that the conference has shared ways to get in touch with Jen and myself, but, what I take from this is this idea of, kind of take heart, is kind of, this is a taking stock opportunity to say, how have we arrived at where we're at right now? What does it mean to move forward in a productive way, in a way that we're able to kind of ratchet down the vitriol and be able to see each other as human beings that need to be seen, heard, recognized, valued, and sort of bringing those conversations back. I know in my work in local government used to say it was never about the planning application, it was always about the fight somebody had over their girlfriend 30 years ago, because it's often the case that we have these deep rifts that sort of escalate on us over time, and if we don't address the emotion in the room first, it's impossible to do the real work moving forward. And so our thoughts and closing out and thinking about what I want to see and what Jen and I would like to see from the next Parliament, and what I would hope and encourage everyone else to reflect on as well, is maintaining those lines of touch points with your candidates beyond the election period, ensuring that we're sharing the good work that folks like yourself at SURF and SEDEC and everyone that's joining us is communicated with the people that are making decisions on our behalf, and then to make sure that we're taking care of each other in the process. So thank you so much to Jen. A full circle moment for me. When I started at Guelph, Jen was an upperclassman, and I was just in awe of her then. I remain in awe of her now. And it's hilarious to me to come kind of from 2003 to 2021 full circle and getting to do this work. I never would have dreamt it in that time as well. So thank you to Kathleen and Kyle, Surf, Isabel, John, the team at SEDEC. Thank you, Jen, for joining us this morning. Lots to think about and plan for and move forward as we head into the next Parliament. So we'll see what happens next and onwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ashley.
What a great session. Wow, you have brought to us so much richness. You encourage us to think about caring and about courage, about being safe and by being responsible and listening to each other. I think you also really brought to the fore the importance of creating trust and caring for ourselves and each other in this journey. So wonderful, profound, and insightful. Thank you very much, Jen and Ash, for your courage to be with us, your time and your creativity. I look forward to further. I mean, I too could have enjoyed you continuing on the conversation, but we have so many other great folks coming up. Thanks again for being with us. Such a joy.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Oh, our next guest is no stranger to the challenges rural communities experience throughout Canada. I am very pleased to welcome Shazia Sobhani to the platform to share her perspective on another critically important topic of rural economy, and that is connectivity. Shazia is Vice President of Customer Network Implementation at TELUS, and in her 15 years with TELUS, she has held a variety of leadership roles across the wireline and wireless businesses, including churn management, pricing strategy, and management of wireline network assets. Wow, there is so much in there I'd love to learn about. What a rich background, but wait, there's more. In the last 7 years, Shazia has played a key role establishing project management and capital management models for pure fiber, network build, and copper turndown strategies. In her current role, Shazia is focused on accelerating fast and high quality broadband connectivity to boost community-based economic and social outcomes with an intention to minimize the digital divide. How fortunate are we that we have you with us today, Shazia? We wish to extend to you a warm SEDEC and Surf welcome. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thanks for all those kind words. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts on a topic that I am truly passionate about. I would first like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that I am calling in from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes Blackfoot Confederacy comprising Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina Nations. Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I have no doubt that we all recognize that how important is the rural connectivity, and especially for Indigenous communities. But what I want to talk about today is the power of rural connectivity in terms of connectivity saving and transforming lives and fueling economic stimulation. I want to start by sharing a small story. 2 years ago in October fall, the director of Innu Band Council of Unamen-Shipu was returning home by boat with a travel companion after a trip to Kegaska, Quebec's easternmost community. They were navigating in shallow waters when the small craft began rocking violently. To avoid the perils of capsizing, Norma Belfleur and other men jumped into the icy Gulf of Saint Laurent. The pair managed to swim to a desolate island and call for help since one of them had functioning cell phone. Now consider that a year earlier, Quebec's lower North Shore region did not have access to wireless phone services until TELUS expanded its network coverage and deployed high-speed internet to 14 villages in this vast and roadless territory. Thanks to a partnership with the federal and provincial governments, 5,000 residents now benefit from connectivity through one of the most extensive and advanced microwave ecosystem in the world. Before that, Norma's story would likely have had a very different ending. Connectivity does not only save life, it also transforms life. It's connectivity that's given community leaders the means to help protect the health of residents by staying informed and in constant touch with authorities managing the fast evolving COVID-19 situation wherever they are at home or traveling within the region. Such communication bridge can mean the difference between having a few cases and a widespread outbreak. In addition, connectivity enables access to virtual medical care, which can be a lifeline in rural areas where there are severe shortages of family physicians and other healthcare professionals. Take an example of Westlock, Alberta, an agriculture town with a population of just over 5,000 people located an hour north of Edmonton. There, people were able to easily switch to working and learning from home using VPN and internet-enabled phone calls when the pandemic began because we connected households and businesses to our gigabit-enabled next-generation pure fiber network. This would have been nearly impossible without that upgrade. Plus a regional healthcare hub, Westlock is a destination for those who require hip and knee replacement surgeries. The improved network has made a huge difference for the hospital and medical clinics by enabling faster diagnostics, the use of electronic medical record, high-speed video connections, and electronic prescription. Now, the image may come to your mind when you hear rural, may not necessarily be Westlock or even Carstairs, Alberta. Carstairs is only half an hour drive north of Calgary. But if you take a look at the map, the area that separates the town and the closest urban center is fairly undeveloped. It's mostly farmland. And that's where Olds College established its Smart Farm, a 2,800-acre living lab where students, instructors, and industry research and test ag tech innovations. Most of the property there is connected, except for 310 acres west of Carstairs, or just a little over 1 square kilometer. The dead zone forces team members who are out in the field to hop in a vehicle and drive towards the highway anytime they want to make a call or do an internet research or just send an email. Cell phone service, dead zones, and slow wireless connection speeds are an issue for farmers all over this country. They can hinder productivity, not to mention pose a real safety risk if farm workers are injured and stranded without ability to call for help. Beyond that, not being able to leverage broadband networks limits growers' ability to use emerging advanced farming technologies. Autonomous farm vehicles could be an asset in the face of growing labor and skill shortages, for instance. Sensors and drones can provide valuable data to improve operations and lead to higher yields, reduce waste, and improve profitability. We recognize that connectivity is central to the digital transformation of agriculture industry. As part of a 5-year strategic partnership with TELUS Agriculture and Olds Club, we are testing a first-of-its-kind repeater solution. The device, much like what you can buy for your home to amplify your Wi-Fi, captures the signal from the nearest cell tower and boosts it to extend coverage. Repeaters aren't new technology. However, this particular design is a trial for a solar-powered do-it-yourself solution for farmers that would not require a technician for installation or maintenance. Feeding Canadians and the world is a tough job. Reliable wireless service and high-speed internet have the power to help address agriculture and food sector challenges. Connectivity is also a precondition for prosperity and for economic stimulation. Connectivity can contribute to stemming rural decline and foster revitalization. We have seen the reports of the region that were experiencing depopulation prior to the pandemic, seeing the tide reverse with young families choosing to leave the city. With the ability to work remotely, people realize they can live anywhere they choose. And as housing prices in large cities skyrocket, the quality of life of rural communities is more and more desirable. Connectivity inevitably increases the appeal, not just for outsiders, but also for residents who might have considered leaving, by opening the door to the rest of the world and generating unprecedented opportunities for growth as well as for economic inclusion. In Pakao-Shipu, entrepreneurial Inno women are selling their art beyond the village thanks to the internet. They are now a driving force in the economic development of the community. Meanwhile, those efforts are keeping their culture vibrant as well. On Vancouver Island, we have built 2 new cell towers for a total of $2 million, bringing vital wireless voice and internet services to Cold River and its adjacent community for the first time. They are now setting their sights on growing their reputation as global eco-tourism centers. For TELUS, Gold River marked a critical milestone. It was the last BC town with a population of over 1,000 to connect to the network. At TELUS, we are constantly hearing about connectivity empowers rural Canadians, and those success stories push us to scale our investments because too many people are still left behind. According to 2017 Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, only 46% of rural households have access to high-speed internet. It is even lower for Indigenous communities, where a third of households have access to a speedy connection. We are working hard to make a dent in those numbers. TELUS has connected more than 500,000 rural households across nearly 200 communities to our Pure Fiber Gigabyte network in the last 8 years. That represents an investment of over $1 billion, a staggering 20% of our total expenditure in Pure Fiber investments. And by leveraging our wireless network, we have expanded high-speed internet across 410,000 rural households across BC, Alberta, and Quebec. Naturally, we can't do it alone. While private investments do go a long way to help close the gap, there are parts of Canada where it's simply economically infeasible for private entities to build infrastructure alone. We believe the digital divide and our shared goal of connecting Canadians could be accomplished by applying several principles. But where change is absolutely necessary is in spectrum policy. Canada's geography is diverse, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to bringing broadband to different parts of countries. In many areas, we can run fiber optic cables through a wireline connection. In other areas, running fiber is extremely expensive and time-consuming and nearly impossible to create connectivity with affordability. A more time and cost-effective solution is fixed wireless internet, broadcast from towers through radio signals and airwaves known as spectrum, which are public and regulated by federal government. TELUS and other telecommunication companies buy spectrum licenses at government-run auctions to offer wireless coverage in Canada. You're probably aware or heard of an auction for licenses in the 3,500 megahertz band taking place this summer. That range of airways can carry larger volume of data and is key to providing 5G services and fixed wireless internet connection. Licenses cover specific geographic area and typically last for 20 years, and they come with public service obligations. The government also sets aside about 40% of available spectrum to certain smaller and regional bidders, with a stated goal of supporting competition. Too often what ends up happening is that the licenses are bought by those companies under the market price and are never utilized and are sold for profit to other telecommunication companies. So with that practice, instead of using the spectrum to build new infrastructure to deliver services and connect rural and remote areas, some companies are just making enormous profit on what is a public resource like water. We advocate for spectrum to be in the hands of those who will actually use it to connect Canadians, so we are advancing for reforms to remedy the situation. Namely, the elimination of set-asides and strict use it or lose it policy with enforced condition for deployment in rural areas within 3 to 5 years. We believe that using a combination of technologies coupled with coordinated public-private partnership models and supportive federal and provincial policies that unleash spectrum and funding, all of Canada can be connected by 2025. it is entirely feasible. So we invite every Canadian, but particularly our fellow advocates for rural prosperity, to reach out to the government to ensure that spectrum allocation process does not favor urban centers over rural areas and that funding models are more effective. For those of you who would like to better understand the spectrum licensing process and how certain policies are impeding connectivity initiatives in rural areas, we will be holding a virtual workshop later this year. Watch for more information in the Creative Innovation Economies newsletter. In closing, remote work is here to stay. Students may be physically going back to work, but the future of learning is digital. Having an online presence is pretty much essential for businesses, big and small these days. And that is as true in rural communities as it is in urban centers. So connectivity is a lifeline. It's transformative. It's the gateway to opportunity and prosperity. Let's get all Canadians connected. Thank you.
Shazia, that was superb. Thank you so much for such helpful comments. You really helped to shine light on so many dimensions that many may not have been thinking about, how connectivity it can be life-saving from your story. It can be life-changing. It can support prosperity and resiliency. Connectivity also protects and projects culture. You really enabled us to appreciate many dimensions, and I'm sure many in our forum would love to talk to you more and would join with you in that spectrum licensing session. So we look forward to pumping that out and having colleagues join in when they can on that. There is much that could be further discussed, but perhaps you could share with us, Shazia, some ideas of how these folks gather together, researchers, strategists, rural wizards, creators, innovators. What might they be able to do to help support some of the agenda that you're talking about, the advocacy to government? Is there a call out to action from members here that you would leave us with?
Wow, I would never pass an opportunity like that, Kathleen. Thank you very much. I think there is so much that all of us can do together, right? So I only talked about the spectrum policy, but then we need to look at that, what recently federal and provincial governments have done. We appreciate that through the subsidy programs, right, which have made rural build economically feasible under public-private partnership model, which we call a 3P model, which is public-private partnership. And TELUS had actually written a white paper in November 2020 last year, and we had released it at Telecom Summit advocating for that. And then right after that, when we saw the announcements by the federal government, by ISED, and then by the provincial governments all over the country, that was such an encouraging response to that. So, however, when we look at the availability of those funds, to maximize the impact of those fundings, we need to better target areas of need, improve consistency, and provide incentives that efficiently and effectively leverage those federal dollars. Right. And by that, I mean that we really need to see that how the end users are benefiting. Mm-hmm. Keep building a backbone or let's say a network where nobody is connected at the other end of it, not going to benefit our friends and advocates living in rural and remote areas. Another thing where we can and help through the advocacy is to look at further tax incentives that can help accelerate the effort through further relaxation of accelerated depreciation or some other means where if we can introduce a new support which ties the tax deferral with rural connectivity investments, that can also unlock a new source of funding. And then streamlining federal permitting process to make it easier for network builders and service providers to access federal assets and rights of ways, which can reduce the regulatory burden and can expedite the deployment of broadband networks.
Wow.
And then when we look at the small communities and when we look at the advocacy groups within that, there is a lot that we can do there as well. For example, working directly with their local municipalities. A lot of municipalities now have access to broadband funding. They have access to their local MPs so that those voices can be heard at the table, can be taken into the rooms where you and I don't have access. Engaging with local business community helps, because that helps to create a group with the same objective in mind, and looking at creative ways of unlocking broadband connectivity. And I do want to share 2 examples where we have seen an extremely,
I'm just going to invite you to do that briefly. But your comment, you really built nicely into what Jen and Ashley were just talking about, how important it is to bring these different actors together and tapping into our friends in the business sector as well as government and civil society. So yes, please, if you would give us one more story, an example, and then we'll pass it on.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I'll be quick with that. I think bringing different stakeholders, different advocates together can create really great outcomes. I'll share a story in Pemberton in BC, north of Vancouver, where we worked directly with all the developers and we created a joint funding, which is never heard of. But as a result of that, Pemberton is now connected with Pure Fiber and the residents are enjoying gigabit speeds there.
Well, you did give some really substantial insights on what differences connectivity has made in people's lives and what difference it makes for our economy, for recovery, for resiliency. We are so thrilled that you've been able to join us, and we thank TELUS and Shazia for you joining us today on the podium. It was a real joy to work with you and to learn more together today. And we look forward to the follow-up session and learning more about that through the newsletter. So thank you again very much for your time and insights.
Thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
Bye.
Goodbye. Yeah. So to reinforce the breadth of perspectives across Canada, I am pleased to hand the platform back to Kyle for the exciting release of the State of Rural Canada 2021 report. Kyle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I am really, really excited about this launch because I've been part of this project along the way. I do just want to take a quick second before we move into that, though, and thank everyone for doing introductions in the chat and letting us know where you're coming from. On the East Coast, I saw people joining from the Lower North Shore and St. Anthony. We saw some people joining from Shawville and Baie-Comeau in Quebec, Pembroke in Ontario, as well as some early risers out in BC. So someone was joining from Prince Rupert. I believe in this panel, we've also got someone joining us from Nelson. So thank you everyone for joining and sharing and getting that conversation going. So as Kathleen said, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-editor, Dr. Heather Hall, who is going to help us launch the State of Rural Canada 2021. So this is, it's been an amazing project that we've been working on really closely with a whole lot of contributors. And so I'm really stoked to be able to be part of this launch and this introduction. So I'll just briefly let you know that the title is Opportunities, Recovery, and Resiliency in Changing Times. And I'm not going to delve into it too much because I'm going to let Heather do a lot of that introduction. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Heather Hall. She is an assistant professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development at the University of Waterloo. And she's also the academic director of the Masters in Economic Development and Innovation program. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Heather, to facilitate this launch.
Thank you, Kyle. As Kyle mentioned, this edition of the State of Rural Canada report focuses on opportunities, recovery, and resilience in changing times. The COVID-19 pandemic offered us the opportunity to critically assess and reflect on ongoing issues for rural communities, as well as new trends that have emerged in the context of unprecedented global circumstances. Rural Canada is vital to the socioeconomic fabric of Canada. Rural communities are places of employment, food production, energy generation, resource extraction, environmental stewardship, cultural production, leisure, and perhaps more importantly, rural communities are home to millions of people across the country. However, rural Canada is also in transition, and the COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated many new and existing inequities which are shaping the realities of life in rural Canada and the responses needed for recovery. In particular, a number of key issues and trends are highlighted throughout this version of the State of Rural Canada. This includes the severe implications of climate change on rural economies, infrastructure, landscapes, lifestyle, and people. In addition, infrastructure deficits, from challenges around drinking water to equitable access to broadband, have persisted and intensified due to the pandemic. Another key theme includes the continued cuts to services, programs, and policies in rural areas, a lack of strong local government, and the need for strong rural development frameworks. Rural Canada is also facing a number of powerful rural demographic trends, including population aging, youth out-migration, population decline, as well as population growth and urban to rural migration. Overall, Canada's rural population has been growing, but not everywhere and not as quickly when compared to urban Canada. And colonial practices and inaction by governments continue to shape the health, well-being, and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. However, the case studies presented throughout this report also highlight the resilience of rural people, communities, and organizations as they respond to challenges and change, including the pandemic, devastating forest fires, food insecurity, and economic restructuring. They emphasize the importance of collaboration and the capacity of rural people and organizations to actively shape their own stories of success. Based on the discussions throughout this report, we offer the following recommendations. First, invest in robust rural policy and development, including applying a rural lens and supporting the collection and analysis of rural data. Second, support rural capacity to plan for rural resilience. Third, enhance regional collaboration to address shortcomings in policy development and service provision, as well as build on regional assets. Fourth, take decisive action on truth and reconciliation to support Indigenous self-determination and settler Indigenous relationships and collaboration. And finally, plan for sustainable rural futures by embedding principles of social, economic, and environmental justice into rural programs and policies. We'd like to acknowledge that this edition of the State of Rural Canada was authored, reviewed, edited, and produced by volunteers who generously donated their time and knowledge, including 52 authors and over 20 reviewers. While I can't name everyone who contributed to this report this morning, I would like to recognize the work of Grace Nelson, who is an MA student at Brock University and was one of the co-editors along with myself and Kyle. I'd also like to recognize the work of John Dale, who is an MSc student at the University of Guelph and created the amazing 2021 SORC website. Like previous editions of the State of Rural Canada, the efforts of all our contributors really highlight the spirit of volunteerism that is often so embedded within rural communities. And we would like to sincerely thank all of the contributors for their time and dedication. I'm honored this morning to introduce 4 amazing authors who will speak to the state of rural in their province or territory and share stories of resilience over the next 30 minutes. And then we will turn things over to the audience for a Q&A. So please share your questions as our panelists are speaking or during the Q&A portion. Our first panelist is Amanda Graham. She is a co-author of the Yukon chapter. She teaches history and Northern Studies at Yukon University and is currently the chair of the School of Liberal Arts. She is also a senior editor of the Northern Review. Our next panelist is Sarah Breen, who is a co-author of the British Columbia chapter. She is the British Columbia Regional Innovation Chair in Rural Economic Development at Selkirk College. Our third panelist is Natalie Lewis. She is a co-author of the Quebec chapter. She's an environmental sociologist and is a professor in the Societies, Territories, and Development Department at the University of Quebec at Rimouski. And our fourth panelist is Karen Foster. She is a co-author of the Nova Scotia chapter, and she's an associate professor at Dalhousie University with the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology, and holds the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada. Thank you, panelists, for taking the time to join us this morning. My first question is for Natalie. What does it mean to be rural in Quebec?
Bonjour, merci, merci de la question.
Good day, and thanks for the question. What does it mean to be in a rural zone in Quebec? The province of Quebec is the second largest province in Canada, so very vast, a huge territory. As far as the population and the GDP, it's the second province after Ontario. So this broad territory has to remove this impression of thinking of rurality as something imaginary with small farms and beautiful landscape. No, the Quebec rurality is up north, it's in mining zones, it's around urban areas, it's very diverse. It's a rurality which is completely diversified, going from the Nunavik, going to the lower North Shore, and one side to the Abitibi, which is close to the Ontario rural areas. So what does rural mean in province Quebec? It's roughly what we describe in this report. We're trying to understand what does rural mean for us. According to StatsCan, roughly 19.4% of the population in Quebec is recognized as being a rural population. Nevertheless, this statistic basically is not representative necessarily of the rurality, because if we think about farmers, we imagine them as being rural. Some of them live in so-called urban areas. So the mixture between rurality and urbanity, to answer the question more simply, what is reality? It's a definition which is quite complex to find, basically. We like to talk about zones of influence of the metropolitan areas. There are various metropolitan zones in Quebec, like in the other provinces in Canada. We can think about Montreal, Quebec City, but we can also think about Sherbrooke, Gatineau, cities that are important. And around these urban zones, there's a kind of a attraction of the rural zones towards the urban zones, and vice versa, urban zones towards the rural areas. So these kind of zones of metropolitan zones of influence are very important because we find there a kind of mixture between the urban and the rural. If we look on the Quebec territory, well, we can see the same phenomenon around smaller, quote unquote, cities that are regional, who will also attract populations that are rural and rural dynamics rather than rural population dynamic, rural dynamics, which will give a color to each one of these ruralities. So for a region that I know better, if we look at the eastern part of Quebec, the Gaspésie area, we've seen these past few years, and the works of my colleague Dominique Morin have showcased this, we've seen populations from the large Montreal Crown translocate towards the Gaspésie area and to regroup themselves around rural municipalities who become a bit more central. We can think about in the Baie des Chaleurs, Carleton-sur-Mer, Bonaventure. So these municipalities that are rural are kind of a mixture between a population which left, the greater Montreal area and who transported themselves toward the eastern part of Quebec and who are kind of recomposing that reality. So rurality, it's something which is, after all, changing, and it's very stimulating.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think that was certainly a trend we did see across the country, is just the different ways rural is defined, even within provinces and territories. Perhaps I'll ask Amanda the same question. What does it mean to be rural in the Yukon?
Yeah, a good question. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Ton Quechang and the Kwanlin First Nation. And it's important that I say that because really for Yukon, rural is First Nations, and it's in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, it's everything that's not Whitehorse. Unlike all the other parts, well, most of the other parts of Canada, we have one big urban center, Whitehorse. That's the center of weight, the big ball in the middle of the rubber sheet that draws all of the attention and the focus is on Whitehorse. It's 37,000 people. The other 10 live elsewhere. That where, as Natalie just said, she's got pockets of communities that draw it across the province. In the Yukon, it's Whitehorse is the center, and it's the drawing force. And we have, as in Quebec, we have those pockets of semi-rurality around Whitehorse, where people are enjoying a kind of a more expansive lifestyle, but within reach of Whitehorse. And I think that possibly that's what makes Yukon different in many ways from sort of rurality in rural areas in other parts of the country. We say 77% of the population is Whitehorse, and the rest of it is in very small communities. And when I say small communities, I mean 2 communities total 3,800 people. Dawson and Watson Lake are the other 2 large communities, and both of them are around 2,000 and fewer people. So the rest of the population is scattered into 13 to 15 tiny communities. Some of them are municipalities, some of them are not. And but what is an important feature of the space in Yukon beyond Whitehorse is the presence of self-governing First Nations and the consequences they've been having to the landscape here. That the land claim project that established the modern treaties 25 years ago have, certainly for the first 4 and for many of the subsequent First Nations, placed those First Nations in the centers of their communities and have allowed them to develop authorities, control, and capacity to transform their communities, those small communities, in extraordinary ways. I think that we find ourselves here, when located in Whitehorse, we think of rural as being the communities, and I put it in quotation marks, and I mean it, capital C communities. That in Whitehorse we don't tend to use the word rural Yukon much. We tend to talk about the communities as being the space beyond Whitehorse, the part where pressures are different, where goals are different, where family and culture and connection seem much more present and much more immediate than perhaps in Whitehorse. And it's a difficult thing to explain what I mean when I say the communities, because it's one of those terms that you kind of have to grow into using it to know when it's the right word and when you just mean communities with a small c. And that for our authors, for the authors of our chapter, it was a point of discussion now and then during the writing of our chapter. But I think that the short answer, what is rural in the Yukon, is anything that is not Whitehorse and is predominantly very small, very community-based, very tight-knit, but not in any way backward. That in fact, a lot of the most important developments in the Yukon are happening in the communities. And I think I get a chance to tell you a little bit about that later. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And we'll look forward to some of those stories of resilience and some of the innovation that's coming out of the communities. And I think it's important to recognize that in some provinces and territories, even the largest cities or urban centers could be defined as rural in the national sense, but for those provinces and territories are the large urban centers. So it's really interesting when we look at the diversity across Canada of what it means to be rural, can be quite different from one province or territory to the next. And again, even within those provinces or territories. Sarah, I was wondering if you could tell us about one of the top trends facing rural communities in British Columbia.
Absolutely. So I would also like to start by acknowledging that where I'm at in Nelson, BC, we're on the traditional territories of the Sinixt, the Syilx, the Ktunaxa, and the Secwepemc peoples. And in terms of trends, I'd like to point to that of climate change and the related natural disasters. And so it's still 2021, it's still in progress. And our current fire total this year is about 1,600 fires, 850,000 hectares burned. And for many of us, 2021 was the first time that we saw wildfire destroy an entire community. If we look at 2017 and 2018, they were also record-breaking seasons, both of which had over 1 million hectares of forest burned. So in 3 years, for scale, we have burned the land size of a small European country. And these fires have impacted economic development, particularly tourism, as well as health and quality of life. For anyone who's ever been to Nelson, there were days this summer that I couldn't see the mountain on the other side of the lake. I couldn't even see the lake. There were days when our regional air quality was so bad that we could compete with, or we could outcompete rather, cities across the world for major air pollution. And this is just a snapshot. That's not even getting into record-breaking floods like those experienced in Grand Forks in 2018, or increasing prevalence of rock slides and landslides. And all of these natural disasters are heavily influenced by climate change. The more climate change accelerates, the more this is going to happen. And that makes climate change adaptation and resilience critical for rural communities. I was thinking of Jen and Ashley's amazing discussion first thing this morning. When it comes to climate change, this isn't something that we can just lay at the feet of the federal government or of other nations and say this isn't our problem to deal with. This is a problem that everyone has to look at and deal with. It's not just massive actions like climate change or like carbon taxes that are national. It's local fire smart and fuel reduction. It's green infrastructure and future-proofing our infrastructure based on up-to-date climate models. It's emission reductions, public education. And I think for rural communities, particularly rural communities in BC, we absolutely can be leaders in this space. There are many communities that are already demonstrating leadership in this space. And as far as a trend goes, well, it is quite daunting and a little bit scary. There's also a huge amount of opportunity for us to be innovative and take that ownership over the future health of our communities.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think that was one of the major trends that we noticed throughout the chapters in the State of Rural Canada was really just the severe implications that climate change is having on rural communities, their economies, their infrastructure, the landscape changes that you've discussed, and lifestyles, and the people who live in these communities. And I wholeheartedly agree that we can no longer wait to take action, and that rural communities can really be leaders, I think, when it comes to climate change adaptation and resilience. Perhaps we'll turn it over to Karen and ask the same question. What is one of the top trends facing rural communities in Nova Scotia?
Thanks. So we obviously face challenges around climate change as well, but I wanted to focus on a different trend that's affecting rural Nova Scotia, and that is housing affordability and availability. So long before the pandemic, at least 5 years before COVID, we were already seeing signs of the housing supply across Nova Scotia being strained, whether you looked at single family dwellings or apartments, affordable housing, all the way on up. And the pandemic just exacerbated that. The theory, which I think has some credibility, is that our low COVID numbers made us an attractive place to move. So we saw a lot of internal in-migration, people from the rest of Canada moving in. And we didn't have as much of an economic setback due to COVID. So hiring kind of kept a pace. Of course, we saw job losses and we saw people being furloughed, but by and large, we weren't as affected economically. And so there was an influx of people on top of an already slowly growing immigration and in-migration rates. And we've now arrived at the point where in rural and urban communities alike in Nova Scotia, there is an acute housing shortage. And house prices have increased. The last I checked, and as we reported in our chapter, prices had gone up 26.7% from March 2020 to March 2021. So people are being priced out of their rental units. People are being priced out of the market if they're looking to buy a first home or to buy a second home, as in like move to a second home. And one of the things that has also impacted this, particularly in rural communities, is the short-term rental market. So there are a lot of homes in Nova Scotia's more, I guess, tourism-focused rural communities that are just rented out on a short-term basis through Airbnb. And you do have to join a registry if you start an Airbnb, but beyond that, there's not really much in the way of restrictions on what you can do, how many you can own, and I think that there's probably a lot of tax evasion going on as well. So while communities are seeing maybe some benefits in terms of bringing tourists to parts of the province that don't have or didn't have tourist accommodations, conventional ones, before the rise of short-term rentals, the impact on housing availability for locals, particularly the rental market, is probably outweighs the benefits. And another related problem is just a mismatch between the types of housing that people need in rural communities and what's available. And one of the things that we see in smaller communities is that there are not enough options for seniors who can no longer live at home without support. So there aren't, supported housing options for them. And there aren't enough handymen to go around to help people, maintain their homes after they're no longer able to do it themselves. People have difficulty finding supports, in-home, say, health supports. And the same goes for people with disabilities in rural areas. And then there also aren't enough say small group homes or kind of a step below nursing homes for people to move into. So that's affecting people as much as just a generalized shortage would. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Karen. And it was certainly, I think, one of the trends that we saw in particular in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, of that urban to rural migration that seemed to become more accentuated during the pandemic, with people moving either semi-permanently or permanently to rural communities for access to amenities or affordability, more space compared to what they had in more urban centers, but then also just people going to rural communities to experience that as cities were perhaps still in lockdown. So really interesting kind of conversation happening over whether those trends will be long-term or whether we'll see a shift as people return to work and what that might mean, but certainly the issues of that driving up the prices for people who do live in those communities, particularly in the rental. And I think it's a really important point about how we encourage and facilitate people to age in place. And we know that a lot of rural communities are experiencing an aging population. And I think that that needs to be a conversation going forward, is how do we make sure that there are supportive housing options in our rural communities or services that are available for them, for people to be able to make that choice to age in place if that's what they would like. So this question is for all of our panelists. Can you share one story of rural resilience from your province or territory? And perhaps we'll start out in British Columbia with Sarah.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about a story from the northwest of BC, from the community of Kitimat. And so when COVID hit, the community of Kitimat faced a number of issues, particularly, interruptions to actions around reconciliation, how to deal with mobile workers, business capacity. I'm sure these are challenges that other communities across the country faced as well. And so the district of Kitimat created local funds to help strengthen the resilience of local businesses and organizations. And these funds supported things like distribution of PPE to local businesses, small things like placing umbrellas around town to help shelter people having to wait outside due to social distancing, dedicated government staff people to help answer questions around COVID, help for businesses to move forward, doing business online, and many more kind of small local actions. And this might feel very familiar to people across the country. I know across BC, communities came up with all these different creative and innovative ways to try and deal with COVID-19, helping to expand patios, waiving permit fees, all of these types of actions. And while there's common themes among all of these, the responses really highlight the importance of place and communities putting their own unique spin on things or taking action in a way that reflects the specific needs or the specific area where they're at. And I return to that umbrella example, because if you live in a town where you get over a meter of rain every year and you're standing outside, umbrellas are kind of a big thing. That's a small action that can increase the comfort and the comfort of customers and patrons and help them, continue to patronize businesses. And so it's that place-based action piece that I think that case study highlights.
Thank you, Sarah. Maybe we'll turn to Amanda in the Yukon.
We certainly saw COVID was certainly a point at which sorry, I should say that again. COVID was important for us because in the context of the study and our discussions about rurality, it highlighted so many things that are invisible in so many other contexts, that the lines of authority between the territorial governments through the municipalities had been engineered in the sort of the traditional and, dare I say, colonial time, that the territorial government speaks to the municipalities will organize what goes on. But the legislation that created the responses to emergencies hadn't really been tested in the way that it was under COVID. And what we found was that the territory to municipality totally overlooked the First Nations governments that have grown and flourished in the communities. And so while certainly initially the territorial government was calling the mayors and the chiefs of the First Nations to discussions about how to cope with COVID, in actual fact, a lot of the legislation and the regulations prevented easy communication and easy working together between the three kinds of governments. And I think that for going forward, what we learned from the COVID experience, aside, that from that governance angle, what we learned from COVID is going to give us points of discussion to modernize and to improve the lines of communication and the lines of authority between territorial, municipal, and First Nations governments in the communities. And certainly COVID also highlighted the incredible reliance that tiny communities have on very what somebody once called the STP, the same 10 people. And those same 10 people are the ones who keep stepping up to be on the committees, to go to the conversation, to phone their neighbors, to organize stuff. And that under a crisis like COVID or flooding or fires, that the STPs end up bearing the brunt of a lot of this, and that we need to figure out how to expand the capacity of communities beyond those same 10 people, so that we avoid the kind of terrible burnout that can happen with people who care deeply about what's going on in their communities. But I think the certainly COVID would be the best answer to that question. But I'd like to slip in the other answer that I gave in the chapter, and we highlighted one particular. The First Nations are working in their communities with an important project of developing and promoting what we would call security in a kind of the original sense of the word, the capacity of the community to provide the things that people need continuously and sustainably. And we gave a list of a number of projects, and they were a small list of representative projects that included things like energy security and food security and the like. And our case study looked particularly at the Trondheim farm, which was established by the First Nation in cooperation with what was then Yukon College, and built up a food producing farm just outside the limits of Dawson on the site of an old dairy farm. And it's now serving as a point of information for people who wish to raise chickens in their own backyards in town. They sell supplies to help people who are raising rabbits and chickens and the like. They're raising pork. They've got a website that sells 20 different kinds of vegetables to the community. They organize veggie boxes that are delivered by subscription to members of the community. And the farm itself is hiring 20 odd people over the course of a year. And they won an Arctic Inspiration Prize, a $500,000 Arctic Inspiration Prize, to help fund the construction of a 10-month greenhouse. And that's the work of the First Nation with the community, identifying something that was important and installing the capacity to feed themselves to a certain degree. And the local free newspaper called What's Up Yukon last week put an issue in my mailbox, and the whole center section, there's like 5 pages of it that speaks specifically to First Nations as independent power producers. And they're listing 5 or 6 different projects in communities where solar panels, wind, geothermal are all under consideration to try and reduce the reliance on diesel and to produce low-cost power in communities. And these are the kinds of things that are truly exciting and are being led by First Nations governments. And that also highlights to us and the chapter authors that the importance of finding ways to understand our rural and their landscape as being very much made up of not just the territorial government and the municipalities, but the territorial government, the municipalities, and increasingly, I would rank them territorial government, First Nations governments, and the municipalities. And that's where I think we're seeing some real strengths. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Maybe we will turn next to Natalie in Quebec.
Oui, merci. C'est fascinant d'écouter tout le monde.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating to listen to people because these realities are very daily life, and it's almost parallel. In ways, they're very similar. So yes, COVID, the crisis that we're almost through, shall we say, is a revealer of all kinds of things. It has been said, and I will repeat it. It's a revealer of rurality with a new color that we saw through the pandemic, a revealer of the issues that we spoke of in the Maritimes, for instance, and elsewhere for housing in the rural areas as in urban areas, and also the problem with elderly people. We heard a lot about that, and we asked ourselves questions. These are not new realities. We knew these things. And at the beginning, Heather spoke to us that in most of the provinces, in the report that came out, what comes up again and again is the destructuring of certain programs on the national level, social programs, some territorial programs that were mixed up a bit in Quebec. A couple of years ago, for instance, we had governments, government levels, if you want, that were regional. This was restructured in a new way. And to answer directly to the question of an example that was asked for, an example of resilience, because that's what we were speaking of, when there's a crisis, let's speak of the pandemic. In the report, we speak of a research project that we had on climate events, the extreme events, and we're going to see more and more of those. And we led a study in the eastern part of Quebec on climatic events like forest fires, like flooding, or the coastal erosion. There's a lot of coastal erosion in Quebec. It's really, really serious. It's kind of worrisome, to be honest. And I would bring you to a small village at Béjouan-Betz that had a forest fire a couple of years ago. And it's in that situation that we can see how we can react and how we can land on our feet faced with that restructuring that had just gone through, and therefore the networks had not reestablished themselves. And in an emergency situation, is the public networks, private networks, informal networks, community networks that know each other and that kind of reacted, you know. They mobilized themselves quickly, and that phenomenon, because those networks had been destabilized by the restructuring, and then we saw on the local level that in spite of everything, those networks are strong and they're really tightly woven, you know. And so it was effective to take care of people that were, imagine, I think of my colleagues and people in British Columbia this summer. So in an emergency situation, you have to be able to lean on someone and feel that the networks and that the actors around us are solid, well-grounded. And it's that tight, woven networking. Those are informal, community networks, local networks, but they have to, you know, also be in dialogue with all the national level, the provincial, you know, all this has to be integrated. Now we're rebuilding these networks, and this rebuilding, it has to be more durable. We have to stop thinking that we're reinventing the wheel every 5 years. So to be able to work and to act concretely in the field, we need a certain stability, you know. We need tools that are stable, predictable. Today we speak of governance. So for resilience, I believe that our small communities, our rural communities have the tools, but they need help. I was speaking of the older populations and aging populations. We have tools, but we need to keep them over time to be able to construct, to build within the framework of this new normal, which is going to be soon our reality, with all the counter effects and the waves of post-pandemic realities.
Thank you, Natalie. And now we'll turn to Karen, and maybe you could share with us a story of resilience from Nova Scotia.
Sure. So one of the two examples of resilience that we shared in our chapter was the way that our farmers markets pivoted online during the first part of the pandemic when everything was shut down. So for a bit of context, Nova Scotia has the most farmers markets per capita. There are over 40, and 38 of them belong to a nonprofit cooperative kind of network called Farmers Markets of Nova Scotia. And they managed to get most of the markets online faster than any other province or state in North America. So people were able to shop from their individual usual vendors and in a very easy platform, and they were able to get food delivered to their homes or to the farmers market, where they would just go pick up a box, or some other locations across the province. As a result, as far as I'm aware, none of the farmers markets have ceased to exist. They all made it through the pandemic or through the lockdowns anyway. And once they went back to in-person shopping, most of them kept their online storefronts. We along with three other Dalhousie researchers, I've been working on a study where one component focuses on the farmers market experience. And we did a survey of farmers market customers, and the majority of them said that they'd like to keep using the online stores even after they were able to shop in person again. We were now doing a follow-up survey just to see if people indeed are still using the online option. We're interested to know if it's, if people are choosing one or the other, or if they're choosing to mix based on what's convenient for them at the time, or what case numbers are like, whatever is motivating people to do things online. So yeah, that's a very good example of resilience. And at the risk of perpetuating a stereotype, I think some of it has to do with the fact that Farmers Markets of Nova Scotia has a young, tech-savvy, progressive executive. I do think that played a role, because the organization helped each market create an online store, figure out the right platform and figure out the logistics and all of that. So I do think that the executive played a big role in getting that done so quickly. And I'll just mention the other example of resilience that we talk about in the chapter, in case people want to read it, is about an initiative that was started to increase spaces for leisure and gathering for Indigenous, Black, and people of color in rural Nova Scotia. We have that under the heading of the Buy Black Birchtown Initiative, if people want to check it out.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing those amazing stories of resilience, both in the face of what we've been experiencing over the last 18, 19 months in response to the pandemic, but also other changes and needs that are faced by our rural communities across the country. We do have some time for some questions, and I see one there, and maybe I'll just wait for a few others to come in. And I think one of the things that really stood out listening to these stories of resilience, my colleague Tara Vinodre and I did some research over the last year in partnership with SURF, looking at the responses and impacts of the pandemic on rural communities. And we found that there were 5 things that were really important, I think, in how communities were able to respond and hopefully recover. And those were connectivity, so that online connectivity, but also connectivity to communities of practice and place, collaboration, which I think we heard in all of those stories of resilience, as well as context. So going back to what Sarah was saying about how much place matters when we're thinking through how we can respond and craft programs, policies, and approaches to recover. Creativity. I'm inspired, on a daily basis of the stories that we hear coming out of rural communities, where communities are coming up with solutions to some of these very pressing challenges or ways to promote their assets. And then finally, capacity, which I think was really nicely highlighted by Amanda, and how much that matters when communities and people have the capacity to create their own stories of success. That really matters. So one of the questions we have coming in from Shelley is, do you see major differences for accessing programs and services in rural and rural remote regions? So the question again is, do you see major differences for accessing programs and services in rural and rural remote regions? So maybe I see Sarah first, and then we'll go to Natalie.
So speaking specifically within the BC context, I would say yes. And I would add to that as well that, we often juxtapose rural against urban and forget that rural has this whole spread from, those urban adjacent rural communities to the remote fly-in or boat-in or winter road access communities. And then also differences based on size. I happen to live in a larger rural community versus those very small ones. And so when it comes to accessing programs, accessing services, that difference in distance from urban settings, that difference in population size impacts the capacity and directly impacts the ability to access those programs. Rural communities, as some of my colleagues have highlighted, have exceptionally strong social capacity, but it's not limitless. And you have to pick where you can put your efforts, or you will break your social capital. And that means that the ability to compete and to access grants and programs and services and things like that for those smaller communities, and for those smaller communities that are further away from urban centers, that they tend to get a little bit left out.
Oui, ben, je compléterai, mais effectivement, Sarah.
I would complete, but Sarah has well summarized the situation. So, on a national basis, the programs are offered to everyone, but in fact, people are far, and the density of the population is a factor. So the same service will not have the same ease to reach. It won't be the same fluidity, the same ease to reach certain populations. Let's take the example of the school. Education, those are national programs. They have norms and standards and offer children the same services, right? In theory. But a rural classroom far away in an aging rural community with few children, well, yes, programs will help to keep the school open, but those children will not have the same interactions, the same services. We cannot offer the whole array of services in that community, not the same array of services that would be the case for a child in an urban region or a more highly densely populated rural area. So the further we are, the less we have access to the services, even if in theory they're offered everywhere, right? I think of health services. I was often called upon to opine. We're going to cut the clinic because we're going to have more ambulances. So it'll go faster. We're going to go to the hospitals that are regional hospitals so the people will be better healed. But no, when we need daily health care, sometimes it's nice to have a clinic with a nurse that can see us, just walking down the street. So there's a difference, for sure.
And I see Amanda there too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo what Natalie just said about the distance. We certainly, if you're within a couple of hours of Whitehorse, then you can drive to your appointments and you can take advantage of the services offered in Whitehorse. The distance certainly will diminish the overall sort of service per person levels into smaller communities because it's just not cost effective to provide that same range of services to a community of a couple of hundred people. And so, yeah, travel has been a major travel for medical reasons and others has been an important program for the territorial government right from the beginning. We've been paying for students to go south to university. We've been paying for people to go south for operations. That the smart answer is find the money to move people to the services. It's not the best solution. It takes people out of communities at a time when they need their families a lot, but it does allow access to a much greater range of services to people who otherwise might not be able to get them. And I think that the university is a good example of how you can kind of do that. We have small campuses in each of the communities. You might think of them as kind of learning centers, but they're points of contact. They're the distributes the access to the university and to its programming through people who can help other people use the technology to access other people. So in a sense, it provides that technological, the tech savviness to the small communities in a way that is relatively cost effective.
I have two other questions that I can see coming through the Q&A, and we've got about 8 minutes left. So maybe I'll pose the first one. Can any of the panelists offer any suggestions on increasing community engagement beyond the same 10 people?
Oh, I'd be so rich if I could actually answer this. I think that there is kind of that active adaptive management aspect of this, or at least that's how I would think of it, is just like try stuff. try as much stuff as you possibly can to engage people. And that is because meetings that I attend frequently suffer from the same thing. If we have an economic development meeting, I can close my eyes and tell you who's going to be there. And they're all amazing people, and I am privileged to work with them. But getting other people's voices is also important. So changing time of day so that you can get different people who have different schedules, changing days of the week, offering multiple avenues for people to participate on their own time versus in live time, online, digital, just continuously trying to meet people where they're at, whether that's through digital community forums or one-on-one conversations, networking with groups that don't necessarily, that there's no obvious reason why you might want to connect with this group, but it's a whole other network of people that you can bring into the conversation. And so I would just say, like, try everything, try multiple things, try as many things as you can and see what works, because there's no simple way to get people to engage.
Karen, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it is really difficult and that it is just hard work to get people to, you know, whether it's just an engagement thing or whether you actually want people to do work towards some objective. But one thing that that I think comes out of previous research with rural young people is that they can sometimes feel like their ideas aren't listened to and like their opportunities to get involved in volunteer stuff or community consultations are kind of surface level. So I think if you can make sure to open opportunities for input and volunteering and all that stuff to youth and make sure that they are taken seriously, including their ideas, even if they conflict with the kind of established set of volunteers in a community, could go a long way.
Natalie.
Yeah, yes. Excuse me.
Yes, sorry. I don't really have a clear answers. I don't have a magic wand to get people, people can be mobilized. I agree with the others. We have to try all the possible means. Perhaps I'd like to add that we are going towards an era that will go into ecological solutions and negative growth, if you want. And so this mobilization is on many fronts and more difficult. So I think that we're going to have to, during the pandemic, for instance, the use of media, like what we're doing right now, Zoom, Teams, or whatever the platform, will allow perhaps a new way. And I'm not saying that we don't need to see each other face to face, but we're sometimes quite distant one from the other. So I think there's going to be a hybrid model with technology in one hand and transport. And I agree with what was said, different formulas and different users, but the territory is vast. We have ecological issues that are coming at high speed. And there's regional transport. That is a problem. Like, think of regional transport. That's not going very well. I look at my students. I'm in Rimouski, so I'm 6 hours from Montreal. I look at my students that come from Montreal, and they say, people in rural areas are not ecological. They use many cars. They have pickups. They have V8s. They don't have ecological means. But we don't have any trains left. We don't have any more direct air link. We have almost no buses left. So transport, I mean, we have to rethink ecological transport if we want to live far away. And we have to be there. We have to occupy the territory. But let's not only be equitable for those people, we're not going to bring them back to the Stone Age, you know? So transport has to be part of it to mobilize people. That's important for me.
Thank you, Natalie. And maybe we've got about 1 minute left, so I'll see if Amanda did want to add anything to the conversation about how we can increase engagement beyond the same 10 people.
I think that pretty well everybody else has already put their finger on it, is to diversify the projects on offer to attract the people who are not interested in, you know, water or sanitation or construction or whatever, that asking the people who don't normally get asked, like the youth, like the elders, like the people who are perhaps you know, more on the margins of society, that you find out what their interests are, what their ideas for the community are. And I was reminded that a community in Iceland, a coastal community in Iceland, did much the same thing when their fisheries collapsed. That they asked people. They had regular town meetings. They called folk together in small groups, and they had a deep discussion in the community about what kinds of skills they had on board now and what they could turn them to in the future. And I think, you know, looking to your community, looking to the people who live there, and finding out why it's, you know, why the other, you know, 112 people aren't coming to the meetings. You know, maybe it's just a matter of offering cookies.
That works for me. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to join us this morning. And if you didn't have an opportunity to have your question asked, please feel free to connect with any one of the panelists or myself throughout the conference, and we'd be happy to engage in conversation. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Natalie and Karen. I'd just like to remind everyone that you can download the State of Rural Canada 2021 report at crrf.sorc.ca. And there are chapters on every province and territory from across the country. And there are also some videos that were produced to share some of the insights from across Canada. So I'll now turn things back over to Kyle.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Heather and panelists. It was really amazing to see all that come together. I know it's been the product of a lot of work over a lot of time. So thank you everyone for joining us and sharing in that. You know, if you do look back and you look at the key themes of SURF conferences and conferences we've hosted with community partners, themes like resiliency and prosperity and sustainability have been there every year for a long time. So it's really nice to see this all coming together in this version of the report, and really excited to see that out. So definitely get out there, download it, share it with your networks, and get it out to the people. So that does conclude our morning programming today. So thank you for joining us. I do have a few kind of housekeeping issues that I want to direct people towards before we take our lunch break. So the first one is be sure that you're using the different tools on the conference platform. So you have the Smart Matching tool where you can connect with other people. You can also set up a time to meet with these people using the meetings and appointment function. So please check that out as well. And we will also encourage you to share more of this engagement that we're looking for on Twitter as well. So we've got lots of kind of back feed happening about the conference, but the one thing we've got a little bit less of is people sharing where they're joining us from. So we would encourage you to go out, if you're going out for a walk on your lunch break, take a photo, snap a photo of where you're joining from, and you can share us that on Twitter by using the hashtag #ShareYourRural, or in French, Mon Milieu Rural. So get out there, go for a walk, share with us where you're coming from. I think I saw on there, we've only got 2 people that have shared so far. So shout out to Dr. Brennan Lowry, who's joining us from Newfoundland, as well as I think Kate Roberts was the other one that I saw. So thank you to those 2 for sharing. But please, everyone else get out there and share that with us as well. Again, if at any point you have any questions or concerns, I saw some people were having a bit of maybe questions about technology. You can always click on that question mark in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and one of our technicians will help you out and make sure that everything is flowing the way that it should be. So with that, I'll close the morning. Thank you again so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic opening, and I'm really excited about what we've covered so far, and also excited about more of the content that we're going to see this afternoon. So we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock Eastern time, and whatever time that looks like for you, 1 hour from now. And we're looking forward to a great afternoon. The State of Rural Canada report is a report that we publish every 2 years, something we started in 2015, and each year it's kind of taken a different form. So this year we're going back to its original format, which was a regional approach. So we'll have one chapter for each province and territory that covers the key issues in rural in that province or territory. What's really interesting is the way that different provinces are dealing with different issues in different territories. There are many kind of key issues in different provinces. So if you look at in the West, it's really important to talk about oil and gas and changing economies and what that's going to look like. When we look to the East, we've seen very different levels of migration there. In some of the Eastern provinces, people who have migrated into the Atlantic provinces. In the North, we have a whole different set of issues that communities are facing. So what we've asked the authors to do is to talk about what those key issues are in their province over the last 5 years, and then to talk a bit about some of these responses or kind of collective action that community members or organizations have taken in response to some of these changes. So the way people have mobilized resources, they've come together to kind of affect change or build resiliency in their communities. So each chapter will outline those kind of issues, talk about some of those responses, and then also talk about what the future might look like. The State of Rural Canada report is certainly the result of a lot of hard work from a lot of different people coming together to really amplify these stories.